But right now, we're in the middle of the COVID-19. This virus has just inundated the news. As of this morning, 1.7 million cases have been reported of people contracting the disease. People are glued to their TV sets, they're glued to the internet, and want to find out what's happening. How long is this going to last? Is there anything from our past pandemics that we can use to fight this one? But COVID-19 eventually will become a thing of the past. Viruses and pandemics are not new. Pandemics can be dated as far back as 165 AD to the Antiochian plague with death toll of 5 million people. We need to ask ourselves, what have we learned? All these years and we're still having issues with pandemics and viruses? Would you think with all these pandemics dating as far back as 165 AD, we would have learned something from history on how best to prevent and or stop these types of illnesses? When you study history, there is one phrase you will hear time and time again. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. This phrase was written by a Spanish philosopher named George Santayana in his writings entitled The Life of Reason, written between 1905 to 1906. But the original phrase, which is those who don't know history are disdained to repeat it, goes back to Edmund Burke, an Anglo-Irish statesman and philosopher who lived between 1729 and 1797. Today, we are in the middle of celebrating the days of unleavened bread, representing a time in history when ancient Israel came out of Egypt, which represents coming out of sin. We tend to look at Israel's plight and what they went through. But today, we're going to take a different angle. We're going to look at ancient Egypt, more specifically, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the man responsible for maintaining Egypt's power, Egypt's stature, and Egypt's way of life. Hidden in the pages of the Bible, Pharaoh's life has a message and a warning for us. So first, let's get a little background on the structure of ancient Egypt with Pharaoh as its king. According to Joshua J. Mark, the co-founder, editor, and director of Ancient History Encyclopedia, and Mr. Mark's article on Pharaoh published on September 2nd, 2009, he states, the Pharaoh in ancient Egypt was the political and religious leader of the people and held the titles Lord of Two Lands and High Priest of every temple. During the second dynasty of Egypt between 2890 and 2670 BC, King Raneb linked his name by the divinity in his reign with the will of the gods. Following Raneb, the rulers of the later dynasties were equipped with, equated with the gods and with the duties and obligations due to those gods. Chief among these was the maintenance of Mata, Mata being harmony and balance, which had been decreed by the gods and needed to be observed in order for the people to live the best possible life. Mr. Mark continues, as a supreme ruler of the people, the Pharaoh was considered a god on earth, the intermediary between the gods and the people. As such, in his role of high priest of every temple, it was the Pharaoh's duty to build great temples and monuments celebrating his own achievements and paying homage to the gods of the land who gave him the power to rule in this life and would guide him in the next. Now, this is very important. When you look into ancient Egyptian history, they purposely did not record their defeats. They only recorded their victories, showing us how they raised themselves up to be above everybody, marking themselves as godlike. In September of 2007, Mr. Mark writes, the society of ancient Egypt was strictly divided into a hierarchy with the king at the top and his visitors, the members of his court, priests, scribes, regents, governors, the generals of the military, artists and craftsmen, governor overseers of work sites, the peasant farmer, and on the bottom, slaves. Social mobility was not encouraged, nor was it observed for most of the Egyptian history. The gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt were an integral part of their people's everyday life. And it is not surprising that there were over 2,000 deities. Now, can you see this with a background? How a man, born of flesh, could become full of himself, full of pride. Therefore, the pharaohs thought of themselves as not as mere men, but they actually thought of themselves as gods. This hierarchy, sinful society is what Pharaoh ruled over. It was also the society Moses was raised in. Moses knew his station as a Hebrew. He was the lowest of lows. That's why when Moses was talking with God in Exodus 3, he stated, "Who am I that I should go before Pharaoh?" What did God tell him? So let's go ahead and open in our Bibles to Exodus 3. We're going to start reading in verse 10. Exodus 3, verse 10 says, "Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" So he said, "I will certainly be with you." This is God telling him, "I'll be with you." It's like, your coach saying, "Don't worry, I'll be right there with you the whole way. You'll make it." And verse 12 says, "And he said, I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people of Egypt, you shall serve God on the mountains." So simple, easy. God said, "Go, I'll be with you. Don't worry about it." But Moses knew as a slave, it was forbidden for him to go before Pharaoh. But as God said, go anyways. This also brings into mind 1 Corinthians 1:27, where God chose the foolish to confound the mighty. We have a slave, Moses, going before Pharaoh, the mighty of the world, thinking that he was God. This is the first key. Pharaoh thought he was God, so why would he entertain a slave in his court? Go ahead and put a mark in Exodus. Okay, sorry, my notes got a little shifted here. That was key number one, Pharaoh being God. Now, Exodus 4, verse 20, let's continue with the story here. So, and then Moses took his wife and his sons and set them on a donkey, and he returned to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the rod of God in his hand, and the Lord said to Moses, "When you go back to Egypt, see that you do all these wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put in your hand. But I will harden his heart, so that he will not let the people go." Now, this is where God gets a bad rap. The word harden here comes from the Hebrew word chazak, meaning to brace or to tighten, as opposed to relaxing. According to Adam Clark's commentary, it goes to say, all those who read the scriptures with care and attention know well that God is frequently represented in them as doing what he only permits to be done. Now, this is important. You know, we all have choice. Pharaoh had choice. Pharaoh had a choice to make. He could harden his heart, or he could listen to Moses. Adam Clark continues to say, so because a man has grieved his spirit and resists his grace, he withdraws that spirit and grace from him. And thus he becomes bold and promiscuous in sin. Pharaoh made his own heart stubborn against God, and God gave him up to a judicial blindness, so that he rushed on stubbornly to his own destruction. Now, in support of Adam Clark's comments, let's go ahead and turn to James 1, verse 13. James 1:13 through 14 says, let no man say that when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. It's the same thing that happened with Satan and Job. God allowed Satan to tempt Job. God is allowing Pharaoh to make a choice. He's allowing Pharaoh to harden his own heart. That's the second key right there. Pharaoh hardening his own heart. So let's turn back to Exodus. Exodus 7, verse 1 says, so the Lord said to Moses, see, I have made you as God to Pharaoh. Now this is important, because remember, the society that Moses grew up in was a hierarchy society. Moses knew he couldn't go before Pharaoh. Moses needed to understand, in God's eyes, he was no different than Pharaoh. The only difference was Moses was representing the one true God. So the Lord said to Moses, see, I have made you as God to Pharaoh, and Aaron and your brother shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and Aaron your brother shall tell Pharaoh to send the children of Israel out of his land, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart and multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. But Pharaoh will not heed, so that I may lay my hand on Egypt and bring my armies and my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great judgment. Then God gives us the why in verse 5. He says, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring out the children of Israel from among them. God was trying to teach the land of Egypt, Pharaoh specifically, where their place was. That God was first, not Pharaoh. Verse 6 says, then Moses and Aaron did so, just as the Lord commanded. And this is where we have the example of the stakes, where they laid them down on the ground. Pharaoh's magicians did the same thing. Verse 13 says, and Pharaoh's heart grew hard. Notice the phrase. It did not say, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart, but and Pharaoh's heart grew hard, which indicates Pharaoh making a choice to make his heart hard. And he did not heed them as the Lord had said. Now we start the plagues. Now, notice that these plagues were designed to show Pharaoh who God really is. Now, at any point in time through these plagues, Pharaoh could have conceded. He could have turned from his ways. We have the example of ancient Nineveh when Job went before them. When Jonah went before them, they repented. Same thing could have happened with Pharaoh. But as we read through the story, we start out with the water turning into blood. In Exodus 7, drop down to verse 23, it says, and Pharaoh turned and went into his house. He didn't even acknowledge that the water turned into blood. But it did say, neither was his heart moved. So his heart remained hardened by himself. The water remained there as blood for 7 days. Then we have the frogs. Frogs everywhere we have frogs. You would think with frogs coming in and out of every hole, every crevice, you would think something is going on here. But in Exodus 8, verse 15, what does it say? But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief after the frogs had died away, he hardened his heart. Once again, Pharaoh hardening his heart and did not heed them as the Lord had said. Through the plagues, we have lice, we have flies, we have the pestilence on the livestock, the boils on everyone. And still, chapter 9, verse 12, we still have a hard heart. Then we come to the hail that destroys all the crops in the land. Exodus 9, verse 34, what does it say? And when Pharaoh saw the rain, the hail, and the thunder had ceased, he sinned yet more, and he hardened his heart. But not only he hardened his heart, what does it say? He and his servants. Now this shows something important because it shows a prideful heart can leach into those around us. After the hail, we have the locust. Exodus 10, verse 1 says, Now the Lord said to Moses, Go unto Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his servants. So God is recognizing that Pharaoh's heart is hardened and the people of Egypt, their hearts are hardened. Let's drop down to verse 16. Pharaoh starts to get a clue here. Just a clue. Exodus 10, verse 16 says, then Pharaoh caused for Moses and Aaron in haste and said, I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Whoa, change of heart here, right? Now therefore, please forgive my sins only this once, and entreat the Lord your God that he may take away from me this death only. So he went out from Pharaoh and entreated the Lord. And the Lord turned a very strong west wind, which took the locust away and blew them into the Red Sea. There remains not one locust in the territory of Egypt. Whoa, another miracle. There was flies, now there is none. There was locusts, now there is none. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the children of Israel go. Through this whole time, we've got 8 plagues that have already happened. And the 8th one showed a little shimmer. You would think that Pharaoh was loosening up. But then again, he did not let the children of Israel go. His heart remained hard. And still, plague number 9, we have darkness throughout the land. And still, we have a hard heart. We see the Pharaoh's people at this point in time had enough. Exodus 11, verse 3 says, And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, and in the sight of all the people. But we have in verse 10, Pharaoh still had a hard heart. The man over all of Egypt. So the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. After this, we know the story of Pharaoh lets Egypt go. But eventually his pride and the pride of the Egyptians hardened their hearts once more. They took off after the children of Israel. Ancient Israel signified the epitome of pride and sin. Pharaoh represented what was evil and wrong with this world. He represented Satan's mindset. We know that Satan is the originator of pride. Let's go ahead and turn to Ezekiel. Let's read what God's words through Ezekiel has for us. Ezekiel 28, starting in verse 11. Ezekiel 28, verse 11 says, moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation against the king of Tyre, here which represents Satan, and say to him, Thus saith the Lord, you were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. The workmanship of your timbrels, the pipes, was prepared for you on the day you were created. You were the anointed cherub who covers. I established you. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked back and forth in the midst of the fiery stones. You were perfect in your ways from the day you were created, till iniquity was found in you. But the abundance of your trading, you became filled with violence within, and you sinned. Therefore, I cast you as a profane thing out of the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the fiery stones. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your own splendor. Is that not speaking of pride? Does that not say Pharaoh right there? Believing he was God here on earth, that whatever he did was fine. Pharaoh fell into the same pattern as Satan did. This is our warning as well. As all through the proverb, it talks about pride. Go ahead and just write these scriptures down. Proverbs 11, verse 2 says, when pride comes, then comes shame. Proverbs 13, verse 10, by pride comes nothing but strife. Proverbs 14:3, and the mouth of a fool is a rod of pride. Proverbs 16:18, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Proverbs 21, verse 24, a proud and haughty man, scoffer is his name. He acts with arrogant pride. 29, verse 3, a man's pride will bring him low. It's interesting how this book of Proverbs is written to young men, to teenagers. All through this book, you find nuggets of wisdom that we could hold on to for when we get older. Because pride is in each and every one of us. None of us can be exempt from it. It's our human nature. The last scripture in Proverbs we've got is chapter 8, verse 13. It says, the fear of the Lord is to hate evil, pride and arrogance in the evil way, and to persevere and the presence mouth I hate. God hates pride. He hates a hardened heart. God hated everything Pharaoh represented, but it was Pharaoh's choice. Just as we have a choice in the attitude that we want to exhibit. Pride is hard for us as humans to overcome. We want to feel important to ourselves, important to those around us, but pride, as the Bible tells us, and Pharaoh's examples show us, leads to destruction. When we put ourselves in authority over others instead of letting God elevate us, that's pride. When we refuse to budge from our opinion, claiming there can only be one opinion, and not recognize that there could be a difference of opinion, that's pride. Let's look at an example of elevating ourselves. Let's turn to Numbers 20, verse 7. Here we have Moses. The children of Israel are out of water. They're all thirsty. They're griping, they're complaining. You could read that all the way through the scriptures, all the way through their history. Numbers 20, verse 7 says, Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Take the rod, you and your brother Aaron, gather the nation, speak to the rock before their eyes. This is important to remember. God told Moses to speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you shall bring water from them out of the rock and give drink to the congregation and their animals. So Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him, and Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock. And he said to them, Hear now, you rebels, must we bring water for you out of this rock? Wait a minute. Is Moses bringing the water out of the rock? It's God who's bringing the water out of the rock. But at this point in time, Moses elevated himself to be equal with God. He said, Must we bring water out of this rock? Then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod. And water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drank. Verse 12, he says, Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, Because you did not believe, to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel. And there's the key. When something happens in our lives, we give God the credit. We don't do things on our own. We give God the credit. God gives us the strength to do everything. Verse 12 says, Therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I gave them. Moses paid a heavy price. This is a heavy price, even though he was considered the meekest. As Christians, we know everything comes from God. We have nothing that he does not allow us to have. From the physical things we own to the talents and abilities, all good things come from God. When we build a stone wall around our hearts and refuse to acknowledge God, refuse to apologize, refuse to bend, refuse to submit, that's pride. When we refuse to break down that wall and let God's Holy Spirit lead us and guide us, that's pride. And a dangerous place for any Christian, because God will allow us to continue to choose that path and shut off and be shut off, just like Pharaoh. When Moses repented, as we know Moses repented, as he is noted to be the meekest. Let's contract this example by putting God first. At the end of his life, Samuel had advice for the children of Israel. In Samuel 1, verse 12, chapter 12, verse 24, he says, Only fear the Lord and serve him in truth with all your heart, for consider what great things he has done for you. When we look at everything God has done for us, how can we not humble ourselves? How can we not thank God? How can we not go before him earnestly on our knees? How can we make the choice of elevating ourselves? It's because we have human nature. And all of us are susceptible to that human nature at any point in time. When can we not serve God in truth with our whole heart if it has a wall of stone around it? Pride was the downfall of Lucifer, who became Satan. Pride was also the downfall not only of Pharaoh, but all of Egypt. As spiritual Israel, we must not walk, but run in the other direction. Let's close by reading in Hebrews 3. Hebrews 3, verse 7. The writer of Hebrew reminds the people of the New Testament of where they came from. He says, therefore, as the Holy Spirit says today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion in the day of trial in the wilderness, where your fathers tested me, tried me, and saw my works 40 years. Therefore, I was angry with that generation and said, they always go astray in their hearts, and they have not known my ways. So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Beware, brethren, here is the warning. Beware, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. But exhort one another daily, while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. To exhort someone means to call, to aid, to help, to comfort, to encourage, to beseech, to entreat, to invoke God. These acts are not exhibited by a prideful person, but a person who thinks of others first, a person full of humility, which is the opposite of pride. God saw fit that each of us have a copy of history sitting in our laps. We read about the mistakes and triumphs of others. The choice is whether we want to learn from Pharaoh's mistakes or repeat his mistakes. Thank you, everyone. Have a beautiful Sabbath day and the rest of the days of unleavened bread.